Listen, one of the reasons I consume so much military history is to try and understand what it is that made the masters of war so successful. That is, what could Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan do that others could not? And when reading about Napoleon, what stood out to me is that he was so versatile, so skilled at so many different things that he could dominate just about any tactical situation. He was just as comfortable planning a great offensive as he was dictating a theater of defense. He knew how to time a counterattack, and he had an excellent eye for terrain. But if I had to pick just one thing that made him terrifying, it was his ability to concentrate his forces at a speed that the other armies and generals, well, they just couldn't react to it. And to be clear, as personal as this ability was to the genius of one man, it really extended beyond him and can be thought of more as a function of the entire French army at the time. Because on the one hand, you had men that were imbued with an esprit de corps, which is this French flavor of morale that allowed the nation to not only gather larger armies than its neighbors, but to then march them faster too. On the other hand, those same soldiers were also led by an incredible staff of marshals and generals, allowed to shine in an institution that didn't care who your parents were or what your background was. If you were talented, the opportunities were there. But what tied all these things together, in execution and in delivery, was the way that the French Imperial Army was divided using the corps system. And I want to talk about what this was a little, because not only does it help explain so many great Napoleonic victories, but it's such an effective system that by 1812, pretty much every European army is using it. So very basically, between 1803 and 1805, Napoleon began dividing the French army into corps, where each corps had anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 men, and was structured to function kind of like a smaller miniature army, meaning that each corps had its own divisions of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, but they also had their own medical, engineering, transport staff, and basically everything else such that they could function independently. Each corps was then handed over to a different marshal, and on a campaign, Bonaparte would give them a time and a place to be at and leave the rest up to them. However, the true genius of the whole thing, and what differentiated it from the division system it replaced, was the way in which these corps worked together. The general rule was that on the move, they were all meant to be within one day's march of one another. And this had a bunch of benefits, like faster movement, fewer supply problems, but by far the largest advantage was that if one of these guys ran into an enemy or was attacked, they could keep that target pinned down long enough and call for the others to come and help. And you get a perfect demonstration of how powerful this was at Friedland, which is a battle where the Russians make the mistake of underestimating how fast the French could move under the corps system. But before we get to the battle itself, let me give you a very brief explanation of events leading up to the battle here on our map of Prussia, where France was once again fighting a bunch of European states that had joined forces kind of like the Avengers in the War of the Fourth Coalition. Now, I'm not going to get into the details too much of why this started or anything, but all that's important for you to know is that in October 1806, the Prussians declared war, and in little under a month are knocked out, leaving only Russia to fight in the arena. So for the first half of 1807, the French and the Russians fight a number of battles, and for a bunch of different reasons, Napoleon was unable to land that knockout punch to end things. However, in mid-June, a chance presented itself when the 5th Corps of Marshal Chandler moved to capture a town called Friedland, where instead of running into a small detachment like they had expected, they instead run into a large Russian army. So, as things stood on June the 13th, you had 12,000 Frenchmen here, and on the other side of the Alle River stood almost 60,000 Russians. And the Russian general in charge, a man called August von Bennigsen, He noticed this numerical discrepancy between the two sides, and having also received intelligence that Napoleon was 15 miles away, he gets this brilliant idea to quickly cross the Alle, punch the French in the face, then run back, just a quick in and out adventure. His tactical line of thinking was to secure the northern and southern flanks here, and to then send his main body of men down the middle, towards the villages of Heinrichsdorf over here, and the village of Postenen a little below it over here, which is where most of the French soldiers were stationed. And so all through the night of the 13th and into the early hours of the 14th of June, thousands of Russian infantry began crossing over bridges for battle. By 4 a.m., the battle had already started, with over 10,000 Russians having crossed the river, supported by the first round of artillery fire. On the French side, Jean Lannes, who had by now already called for reinforcements, understood that until help could arrive, his mission would be to lure as many enemies over the river as he could, and to then keep them pinned down. And so for the first few hours of dawn, most fighting took place over possession of the two key villages in the center, with more and more Russians crossing the Alle, increasing the pressure on the French. In response to this, Lannes pulled from his bag of tactical tricks, which included placing a much thicker line of skirmishers up front, as well as parading the same units of infantry and cavalry up and down his lines, all in an attempt to make his forces look bigger than they actually were. By 9 a.m., the French had received the first trickle of reinforcements, pushing their numbers up to 17,000 and helping them secure both Heinrichsdorf and Postenen. However, the Russians have not given up by now, and they number almost 45,000 on this side of the Alle, with 6 infantry divisions in the center, a Cossack division holding the north, and several thousand more men holding the southern flank, which consisted of wooden terrain and a village called Sortlack. At 10 a.m., the Russians attempt an offensive thrust to the right of Heinrichsdorf, but are instantly pushed back by the leading forces of Marshal Edouard Mottier's 8th Corps, whose arrival helps secure the left flank and brings the French numbers up to 40,000 total. It's also around 10 a.m. that von Bennigsen's starting to realize that not only have his men failed to break through, but that if he called a retreat at this stage, his men would get routed. So he reevaluates his focus from offense to defense, with the goal now being to simply hold ground until nightfall, where under the cover of darkness he would be able to get his men back over the Alle. And in theory, this all sounded very good. Except, oh yeah, Napoleon hasn't even shown up yet. At noon, the French emperor finally arrives from the west, and he's brought with him an additional 40,000 men, which included the first corps of Marshal Michel Ney as well as the Imperial Guard. Now, with the corps system having worked to perfection, he's concentrated almost 80,000 men at the critical juncture, and after taking a look at the battlefield, he knows how to use them. What Bonaparte notices is that the Russians had painted themselves into a giant corner with their backs against the Alle, an overextension so severe that he knew von Bennigsen couldn't do anything about it even if he wanted to. So for the next several hours, the whole battle kind of pauses for a bit, where he and the other marshals and generals make arrangements for how to close the door on this giant trap. Hostilities are ordered to recommence at 6 p.m. with Marshal Michel Ney's First Corps, which had by this time moved to the south over here, and at the sound of cannon fire began to move up to battle for control of Sortlack village and the wooded terrain next to it. It's a tough fight that pushes Ney's men to exhaustion and forces them to move back. However, as they begin to fall back, an artillery division advances and commits one of the very rare, very famous cannon charges in history. And here, listen to the way that Andrew Roberts describes that event in his book Napoleon the Great. Quote, "When Ney's exhausted corps began to fall back, Saint-Armand divided his 30 guns into 2 batteries of 15 each with 300 rounds per cannon and 220 per howitzer. Sounding 'Action Front' on his bugles, his team galloped forward, unlimbered, and fired first at 600 yards, then at 300, then at 150, and finally, with nothing but canister shot, at 60. The Russian Ismailovsky Guards and the Pavlovsky Grenadiers tried to attack the batteries, but some 4,000 men fell to their fire in about 25 minutes. An entire cavalry charge was destroyed with 2 volleys of canister. The Russian left was utterly destroyed and trapped against the Alle River. End quote. Now, besides being a wholly unique and unusual event, what makes this episode so fascinating to me is that the whole thing is kind of like a prelude to the decline of cavalry and the devastation that artillery will bring in the next 100 to 200 years of warfare. And when reading this, I remember thinking to myself, am I living through something similar right now with the introduction of drones? Because there's a lot of talk about how they're going to change the modern battlefield, how they're already changing the battlefield and proving to be very effective at certain roles right now. And it just got me wondering, are we living in this pivotal moment where, like artillery in the Napoleonic era would change things forever, are we living in a similar sort of watershed era with drones? I don't know. I've seen a lot of different opinions everywhere. If you have any insights or any ideas about this, let me know in the comments. But to bring us back to the Battle of Friedland for now, Ney's northward thrust has effectively completed the bottling of the Russian forces, who have nowhere to really run. And while some men in the north did manage to escape, the next few hours are an absolute massacre, where out on this small strip of land, thousands of Russians stood in the open with nothing to protect them from the great French batteries that opened fire, and with hardly any room to miss, they cleared the field for Ney, Mortier, and Lannes forces to move in and conclude a Napoleonic victory. Now, speaking of the Emperor, it's time to put his pieces in the collection book. And for those of you new to the channel, the collection book's just a fun way for me to keep track of all the battles and people I talk about. And I thought this would be a good video to add his bee emblem. The bee being a symbol that Napoleon added to a lot of things he owned, from his robes to painted pictures on wallpapers, whatever. But I thought this would be the ideal video to add this symbol, because the core system I talked about reminds me so much of the way that bees operate, where each bee can be off doing its own thing, but if one of them comes under attack, it sends out a signal for the whole hive to come down. And I also think that the bee is a very fitting symbol for Napoleon, because it captures one of those qualities that's really hard to show in a movie or a TV show or a film, and that's how hard the man worked. A lot of the time in the book Napoleon the Great, it'll be talking about some big battle that's about to take place or some engagement, and not only is Napoleon planning all the details with his generals and marshals, but he's also taking some time to maybe discuss the building of a new school or something, or a new set of laws or whatever. And he was just so relentless in every direction, which, let's be honest, you kind of have to be if you're trying to take over a continent. You don't exactly conquer Europe on a 9-to-5, do you? Now, for the picture of Napoleon himself, I chose this image made by French painter Horace Vernet, hope I pronounced that right, where you can see the emperor giving instructions to his generals at the battle. And for the marshals, we've got 2 of them this time. The first is Edouard Mortier, whose early arrival helped stabilize Lannes' position. And here's his image, here's his sticker that we're going to add. There we go. And we also have one of my favorites, Marshal Michel Ney, the last Frenchman out of Russia. And whilst we're on the subject of marshals, if you're interested in learning more about them, I'd highly suggest you grab a copy of A.G. Macdonell's Napoleon and His Marshals. It's a really good book, which focuses, as the title, hints at very strongly, only on the marshals. And whilst it doesn't go into any in-depth detail on the battles or tactics or anything, it's still a very well-written book, which gives a much more personal look at the men that helped Napoleon build his empire, their personalities, the way they interacted with each other, and, again, no battle maps or in-depth discussion of strategy, but it's still a really fun read. Finally, we've got the Imperial Guard, but they don't get a sticker for Friedland. And that's because while they were certainly at the battle, they didn't really have a significant role to play. You know, Napoleon wasn't in the habit of committing his elite troops for fun, so nothing for them this time. And that's it. That's the Battle of Friedland completed. Thank you so much for watching. If you can like and subscribe as always, I do appreciate it. And of course, give me your feedback, you know, what I can change. I always ask for constructive criticism. It's always welcome. Thank you so much again, and I'll see you in the next video.